It started with two detectives, both decorated, both respected. But behind the badge, they were taking cash, leaking secrets, and carrying out murders for the Mafia. This is the true story of Stephen Caracappa and Luis Eppolito, the Mafia cops, two men who turned the NYPD's trust into the mob's deadliest weapon. If you enjoy our videos, don't forget to subscribe, hit the like button, and share your thoughts about today's topic in the comments. It really helps the channel grow. Let's begin. It started, as these stories often do, in Brooklyn, the kind of place where everyone knew who ran the streets, and silence was the currency that kept you safe. Stephen Caracappa was born on November 12, 1942, in New York City. The son of working-class parents, he grew up in an era when the city was still divided by borough, by neighborhood, by family name. He wasn't born into the life, but he grew up around it. After high school, he joined the US Army, serving as a sergeant during the Vietnam War. He came home with discipline, ambition, and a belief that he could make something of himself in uniform. Luis Eppolito was born 6 years later, on July 22, 1948, in Brooklyn. But his bloodline already carried a name the police knew well. His father, Ralph "Fat the Gangster" Eppolito, was a soldier in the Gambino crime family. His uncle, James "Jimmy the Clam" Eppolito, was a Gambino captain who ran gambling operations across the borough. Even his cousin, James Jr., had been made, formally inducted into the Mafia. In that world, the Eppolito name carried weight and danger. Louis grew up surrounded by the trappings of that life, the whispers at family dinners, the envelopes passed in back rooms, the quiet respect men showed when his uncle walked in. But unlike most in his family, Louis chose a different badge. Or at least that's how it looked from the outside. By 1969, both men, Caracappa, the disciplined army veteran, and Eppolito, the cop from a mob lineage, joined the New York Police Department. Two rookies in the city's toughest force, patrolling streets where the Mafia's power was unspoken but absolute. What no one knew then was that the paths of these two men, one who studied crime, the other born near it, would one day converge in a story that blurred the line between cop and criminal, loyalty and betrayal. Their partnership hadn't begun yet, but the roots were already in the ground. By the mid-1970s, New York was a city running on fumes, crime up, trust down, and the streets ruled by men who didn't need badges to command respect. Inside that storm, two detectives began to make their names. Luis Eppolito was the first to climb. In 1977, he earned his detective shield, loud, brash, and proud of it. He had the look of a street cop from a different era, thick-necked, always in a tailored suit, and never shy about his family name, even though it came with shadows. Around the precincts in Brooklyn, people said he knew how to get things done. The kind of cop who didn't wait for paperwork to solve a case. 2 years later, in 1979, Stephen Caracappa followed. Quiet where Eppolito was loud, deliberate, where the other was impulsive. Caracappa's work ethic and eye for detail landed him in one of the NYPD's most elite units, the Organized Crime Homicide Unit. Ironically, it was the same unit built to dismantle the Mafia's grip on the city. By the early 1980s, the five families were at their peak. The Lucchese, Gambino, Colombo, Genovese, and Bonanno crews all fought for slices of the city's rackets, labor, construction, unions, drugs, and extortion. Detectives like Caracappa were supposed to bring order to the chaos. But for some, the lines between duty and temptation were getting thinner. Then came the scandal. In December of 1983, FBI agents raided a home in Cherry Hill, New Jersey, the residence of Rosario Gambino, a Sicilian-born mobster and major heroin trafficker. Among the evidence, they found a file folder stamped New York Police Department, Intelligence Division. Inside were confidential reports about active investigations, files signed out by none other than Detective Luis Eppolito. It was the kind of discovery that could end a cop's career and expose the cracks in the department's own armor. The NYPD suspended Eppolito without pay. He was hauled before an internal tribunal, accused of leaking police intelligence to the Gambino family. But the case, like so many in that era, fell apart. A police commissioner believed his story that a sergeant had asked him to borrow the file for routine business, that the papers must have been misplaced. There was no proof he'd handed them to Rosario Gambino himself. In April 1985, the department cleared him completely. The newspapers called him the 11th most decorated cop in New York City. The internal affairs file was closed. He went back to work with $11,000 in back pay and a chip on his shoulder. Not everyone bought the story. Joseph Coffey, the hard-edged commander of the organized crime task force, had known both men before he retired. He'd seen the suits they wore, the money they spent, the company they kept. It was well known they were hooked up with the mob, Coffey later said. I couldn't afford a $2,000 suit, and they could. Does that tell you something? By 1984, whispers followed them through every precinct house in the city. But there was no evidence, not yet. And in the NYPD, without proof, whispers meant nothing. The two detectives kept their badges. The streets would take care of the rest. By 1985, the Mafia had begun to feel the heat. Federal indictments were stacking up, bosses were being watched, and the walls were closing in on New York's 5 families. Inside the Lucchese organization, one man was willing to fight fire with fire and cash with blood. His name was Anthony Gaspipe Casso. Casso wasn't just an underboss. He was the kind of man who treated murder like business. Paranoid, calculating, and cruel, he was desperate to stay ahead of law enforcement. To do that, he needed a window into the NYPD, and he found it in 2 detectives who wore the shield by day and took his money by night. Starting in 1985, Casso and his boss, Vittorio Vic Amuso, began paying Stephen Caracappa and Louis Eppolito $4,000 a month, bribes disguised as consulting fees. In return, the detectives used police databases to feed Casso names, addresses, and surveillance details on anyone suspected of being an informant. They were supposed to hunt for justice. Instead, they were selling it. Their first job was as personal as it was brutal. Burton Kaplan, a mob-connected businessman who served as Casso's go-between, asked them to handle a problem, an Israeli diamond dealer named Israel Greenwald. Greenwald knew too much about a stolen treasury bond scheme. In February of 1986, Caracappa and Eppolito pulled Greenwald over in Brooklyn under the pretense of a traffic stop. They told him he was wanted for questioning in a hit-and-run, cuffed him, and drove him to a Brooklyn garage. Inside, they placed a bag over his head while Frank Santoro Jr., Eppolito's cousin, pulled the trigger. Greenwald's body was buried beneath the concrete floor, where it stayed for 19 years. That same year, an attempt was made on Casso's life. He survived, but he wanted revenge. He ordered the detectives to find out who'd set him up. Caracappa used his access to police computers and produced a list of suspects. One name stood out, James Jimmy Heidel, a young Gambino associate. In October 1986, the 2 detectives tracked Heidel to Bay Ridge, Brooklyn. They showed up at his mother's home in Staten Island, asking where her son was. Hours later, they found him. Eppolito and Caracappa handcuffed him, threw him in the trunk of their car, and delivered him alive to Casso. The underboss paid them $40,000. Heidel was tortured and killed. His body was never found. Around that time, Casso wanted another hit on Salvatore "Sammy the Bull" Gravano, the underboss of the Gambino family. The job fell through, but it showed how deep the 2 cops were in. They weren't merely supplying information anymore, they were part of the Mafia's muscle. Then came a mistake that would haunt them. That December, Casso asked for help locating another suspected enemy, Nicholas Guido. Caracappa and Eppolito ran his name through police systems and delivered the details. But something went wrong. On Christmas Day, a gunman approached a man sitting in his car outside his mother's Brooklyn home and opened fire. The victim wasn't a gangster, he was a telephone installer, an innocent man who shared the wrong name. The real Nicholas Guido was still alive. By 1987, the circle around them began to shrink. Frank Santoro Jr., their own link to Kaplan, was murdered that year while standing beside a man marked for death. And another name appeared on their list, John Otto Heidel, a mob informant. Using police records, Eppolito and Caracappa passed Heidel's location to Casso. Soon after, Heidel was dead. 3 years into their arrangement, the detectives had gone from collecting envelopes to carrying out executions. The men sworn to protect the city were now ghosts working for its darkest corners, cops who could pull a file in the morning and bury a man by nightfall. The Mafia had infiltrated the NYPD, and no one yet knew it. By the late 1980s, New York was changing. The city's crime bosses were under siege from prosecutors, the FBI, and a generation of detectives determined to tear the Mafia apart. But within the NYPD, two of its own had already crossed to the other side. Stephen Caracappa and Louis Eppolito were now full partners in corruption. The line between detective work and contract killing had vanished, replaced by envelopes of cash and quiet nods from the men they were supposed to arrest. Their orders still came from Lucchese underboss Anthony Gaspipe Casso, a man so ruthless that even other mobsters feared his name. And in 1990, he called in another favor. The first target was Anthony DeLappi, a Lucchese soldier who'd fled to Los Angeles after falling out of favor with Casso. Caracappa used NYPD databases to track him down to an apartment complex in Hollywood. Eppolito relayed the information to Casso, who sent gunmen west. On February 4th, 1990, DeLappi was ambushed in the parking garage of his building, shot dead before he could make it to his car. Soon after, another Lucchese man, Bruno Facciola, was marked for death. Casso suspected him of being an informant. Eppolito and Caracappa helped arrange the setup. When Facciola's body was found, his killers had stuffed a dead canary in his mouth, a message to anyone thinking of talking to the feds. Casso was cleaning house, and his crystal ball, as he called the two detectives, made sure he always stayed one step ahead. Then came 1992, the year of revenge. Casso had one last name he wanted crossed off: Edward Eddie Lino, a captain in the Gambino family. To Casso, it was business. But for Caracappa, it might have been something more personal. Years earlier, Lino had been part of the hit team that killed Paul Castellano and Thomas Bellotti outside Sparks Steakhouse, and Bellotti had been Caracappa's childhood friend. Whether it was loyalty or vengeance, he never said. The hit was simple, efficient, and cold-blooded. On November 6th, 1992, Caracappa and Eppolito tailed Lino's Mercedes-Benz along a Brooklyn parkway. They pulled him over using police lights, approached his window, and without a word, Caracappa fired 9 shots into the car. Lino never had a chance. Casso paid them $70,000. That same year, both detectives stepped away from the NYPD. Eppolito retired first in 1990, claiming he'd had enough of the politics. Caracappa followed in 1992, leaving on a disability pension. On paper, they were two decorated cops closing long, successful careers. In truth, they were leaving behind a trail of bodies, secrets, and blood money that would follow them for decades. By the time the department marked their retirements, the Mafia had 2 of its best men, paid for by the city of New York. When the heat in New York became unbearable, both men did what fugitives of every kind have done for decades. They headed west. By 1993, Stephen Caracappa and Louis Eppolito had packed up their lives and settled in Las Vegas, Nevada. Out there, under the desert sun, the noise of New York faded to a low hum. They bought homes on the same quiet street, neighbors once again, just as they had been partners on the force. Caracappa, the quieter of the two, took a job as an assistant chief of security at the Women's Correctional Facility in North Las Vegas. For a man who'd once been one of the most connected detectives in the NYPD's Organized Crime Homicide Unit, it was a strange kind of retirement, guarding inmates instead of investigating them. Eppolito, on the other hand, played a different role. He got into car sales at an Infiniti dealership, holding court with co-workers, and telling stories from his days on the force. He'd even found his way onto movie sets, bit parts in Predator 2, Lost Highway, and Goodfellas. He'd once written a book claiming to be an honest cop trying to escape his family's mafia ties. In Las Vegas, he played the part well, the retired detective-turned-actor with stories too wild to believe. But beneath the sunshine and small talk, the old connections never really broke. The same names kept showing up: Frank Lastarino, a Lucchese capo, Burton Kaplan, the businessman who had once passed cash between the cops and Casso. By 1993, Lastarino reached out again, this time with new contracts, one to kill John Jr. Gotti, the imprisoned mob boss's son, and another to eliminate Stephen Wonderboy Crea, underboss of the Lucchese family. Both plans fell apart before a trigger was ever pulled. Then came another idea, a revenge hit on Salvatore "Sammy the Bull" Gravano, the former Gambino underboss who had betrayed John Gotti and entered the witness protection program. Eppolito and Caracappa were asked to find him, collect the reward promised by Gotti's brother Peter, and close one more score for the old days. But that, too, failed. Gravano was eventually caught not by the mob, but by the DEA for running an ecstasy ring out of Arizona. By 1996, Burton Kaplan was back in federal custody, arrested on drug trafficking charges. He knew the whole story, the payoffs, the murders, the names, but Kaplan kept his mouth shut. For nearly a decade, he said nothing. Back in New York, investigators still whispered about the dirty detectives. But the trail had gone cold, witnesses had vanished, files were missing, and the Mafia itself was crumbling under the weight of its own betrayals. Through the late 90s and into the early 2000s, the story of the Mafia cops had become more of a rumor than a case, a legend traded in bars and precinct houses. No one realized that in a quiet Las Vegas neighborhood, two retired detectives were living ordinary lives built on extraordinary crimes. It would take one man, a career criminal looking for mercy, to bring their past roaring back to life. In the world of organized crime, silence is the closest thing to loyalty. But in 2004, one man decided to break it, and in doing so, he brought down two of the most corrupt cops in American history. Burton Kaplan was 71 years old, serving time in federal prison for running a $10 million marijuana ring. A career hustler and middleman, he'd spent decades in the shadows between mobsters and money. Now he was sick, aging, and running out of time. His only wish was to see his granddaughter outside prison walls. When the DEA sat down with him that year, Kaplan had something to trade. What he told them sounded unbelievable at first. A story about two retired New York detectives who had worked for the Lucchese crime family. But he wasn't spinning a tale. He was confessing. Kaplan laid out everything. From 1986 to 1993, he had met regularly with detectives Louis Eppolito and Stephen Caracappa, paying them cash from Lucchese underboss Anthony "Gaspipe" Casso, $4,000 a month, plus bonuses for contract hits. In all, they'd earned about $375,000 in bribes and murder money. They weren't just leakers, they were assassins with badges. Kaplan described how he'd watched them deliver names of informants, how he'd handed them envelopes of cash in diners and parking lots, how two New York detectives had become mob soldiers in everything but title. For investigators who chased dead ends for nearly 20 years, Kaplan's testimony was the missing piece. But before they could act, someone had to make sure it would hold up. That someone was NYPD, Detective Thomas Dades. Dades had been working cold cases tied to the Lucchese family when Kaplan's story surfaced. He began digging through old records, reconstructing the paper trail left behind by Eppolito and Caracappa. In the files, he found proof, computer logs showing that Caracappa had accessed information on men who later turned up dead. Then came witnesses. Betty Heidel, the mother of James Heidel, told Dades that two detectives had come to her Staten Island home the night her son disappeared in 1986. Their names? Caracappa and Eppolito. The pattern was undeniable. After nearly 2 decades, the walls were closing in. In March of 2005, DEA and FBI agents moved in. The two former detectives were walking into Piero's, an Italian restaurant just off the Strip in Las Vegas, a place known for its red booths, dim lights, and old-school mob clientele. They didn't get past the front door. The agents surrounded them in the parking lot, weapons drawn, ordering them to the ground. Inside Eppolito's car, they found police documents, maps, and evidence linking him back to the murders in New York. The arrests made headlines across the country. two decorated NYPD detectives charged with working for the Mafia. After 20 years of rumors, silence, and blood, the truth was finally out. The Mafia had once had two of New York's finest on its payroll, and the man who kept their secret all those years had just traded it for his freedom. When the trial of Louis Eppolito and Stephen Caracappa opened in Brooklyn Federal Court in early 2006, the city was transfixed. Two former New York detectives, men who had worn the badge, testified in court and collected pensions, now stood accused of betraying everything that badge represented. The charges were staggering: racketeering, extortion, kidnapping, narcotics trafficking, obstruction of justice, and 8 counts of murder and conspiracy. The government called it one of the most shocking corruption cases in American law enforcement history. At the center of it all sat two aging men in suits, expressionless, their faces unchanged from the photos that once hung in precinct halls. The prosecution's case relied heavily on one man, Burton Kaplan, the same go-between who had finally broken his silence 2 decades after the murders began. For 2 full days, Kaplan told the jury how he funneled money from Lucchese underboss Anthony "Gaspipe" Casso straight into the detectives' hands. He described payments, meetings, and coded conversations, outlining how Casso had turned 2 New York City cops into contract killers. The FBI supported Kaplan's story with a mountain of evidence: phone records, computer logs, and recovered files proving that Caracappa had accessed confidential NYPD databases to locate targets who were later found dead. Prosecutors detailed the murders of Israel Greenwald, James Heidel, Bruno Fasciola, Edward Lino, Anthony DeLappy, John Heidel, Nicholas Guido, and Bartholomew Borriello, all tied to their secret partnership with Casso. The defense fought to discredit Kaplan, calling him a liar and a career criminal willing to say anything to shave years off his sentence. Both Eppolito and Caracappa insisted they were innocent, framed by the very system they'd once served. "They can take my life," Eppolito said in court, "but they can't take my soul. I never hurt anybody. I never did any of this." After weeks of testimony, the jury saw it differently. Both men were convicted on all major counts. But on June 30th, 2006, the case took a shocking turn. Federal Judge Jack B. Weinstein, citing a technical error in the statute of limitations, threw out the racketeering conspiracy conviction, the backbone of the prosecution's case. For a moment, it looked like 2 of the most corrupt cops in NYPD history might walk free. The government appealed. 2 years later, on September 17th, 2008, the Second Circuit Court of Appeals reinstated the racketeering convictions, ruling that the crimes formed a continuing conspiracy that lasted into the 2000s. The victory was decisive, and the end was near. On March 6, 2009, Judge Weinstein sentenced the 2 men. Louis Eppolito, once a self-proclaimed honest cop from a Mafia family, received life imprisonment plus 100 years. Stephen Caracappa, the quiet detective who built the organized crime homicide unit only to betray it, was sentenced to life plus 80 years. Each man was fined more than $4 million. For the families of their victims, it was justice long delayed. For the NYPD, it was a scar that would never fully heal. The Mafia cops were finally behind bars, 2 men who had worn the same uniform as heroes and used it as a weapon for murder. When the verdicts were read, New York City let out a long collective breath. The case of the Mafia cops was over, at least in the courtroom, but the damage they'd done would ripple through the justice system for years to come. By 2010, the city began to reckon with the cost of their betrayal. Families of the men murdered through the detectives' corruption filed lawsuits, claiming the NYPD had ignored years of warnings. One by one, the city settled. In total, New York paid $18.4 million to the families of their victims, a sum that could never cover the years of loss, but served as a grim acknowledgement of what had gone wrong. That same year, another case came to light, a man who had spent nearly 2 decades in prison for a murder Eppolito and Caracappa had framed him for. The city awarded him $9.9 million. 5 years later, in 2015, another settlement followed. $5 million to the family of Nicholas Guido, the innocent man mistakenly killed on Christmas Day, 1986. The city's checks couldn't rewrite history. The stain was permanent. In prison, the two former detectives followed separate paths but shared the same fate. Stephen Caracappa, battling cancer, tried to appeal his conviction in 2016 and later filed for compassionate release. Judge Jack B. Weinstein, the same man who'd once overturned his conviction, denied the request, saying, "There is nothing I can do in your case." On April 8, 2017, Caracappa died in a federal medical center in North Carolina at age 74. Louis Eppolito lived 2 more years behind bars. He remained defiant, insisting he'd been framed, calling himself a victim of mob lies and media hysteria. On November 3, 2019, he died in federal custody in Tucson, Arizona. The Bureau of Prisons never disclosed a cause. For the law enforcement community, their names became a warning, a reminder of how power can curdle into greed and how the badge, once corrupted, becomes more dangerous than the criminals it's meant to stop. Many officers called them what they were, traitors in uniform. Decades after their first handshake, long after the envelopes of cash and the blood on Brooklyn streets, the story of the Mafia cops still stands as one of the darkest chapters in NYPD history. Not just because of what they did, but because of what they represented. 2 detectives who turned their shields into weapons. 2 men who sold the trust of an entire city. And a story that will forever haunt the line between good and evil, law and loyalty.